Hey, amazing people. If you're subscribed, then you're a legend. Thank you so much. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please smash that sub button and join the family.
I'll never forget my first date with Diana. It was supposed to be this simple, chill meetup, but everything about it just felt wrong. It's funny now thinking about how everything started out so normal. You know, like one of those casual online connections that people talk about where you meet someone, hit it off, and everything feels exciting. That's what I thought it was going to be. But man, this was way more twisted than anything I ever imagined. It all started on Facebook. I know. Facebook of all places. But hey, it's how people meet these days, right? So I'm scrolling through my feed one evening, just bored out of my mind, and I see this cute girl's profile pop up in my suggested friends. Her name was Diana, and let me tell you, she had that kind of look that made you think, yeah, she's probably out of my league. But still, I couldn't help myself. I clicked on her profile. Her pictures were, well, they were perfect. Not just cute. I'm talking magazine cover perfect. You know, that kind of clean, artsy vibe with just enough of a down to earth feel to make you believe she might actually be real. Her eyes in the pictures had that spark, that kind of smile you get when someone's genuinely happy in the photos. Well, they looked professionally done, but not in the way that made me suspicious. They looked natural, like she was just an Instagram influencer living her best life. Anyway, after a couple of days of her liking my posts and me commenting on hers, we ended up chatting. The conversations flowed like we'd known each other for ages. She seemed down to earth, funny, the kind of girl I actually want to spend time with. So I figured, why not? I asked her if she wanted to meet up for coffee at a Starbucks nearby. She said she'd love to. The day of the date, I'm a little nervous, but I think that's pretty normal, right? You don't know what you're walking into, especially after only talking online. But I kept telling myself it would be fine. Just a simple coffee. No big deal. I show up at the Starbucks around 3 p.m. The place is busy enough, but not packed. I don't see anyone who looks like Diana, so I walk in, check my phone again to make sure I'm at the right location, and decide to grab a seat by the window. I order a caramel macchiato, just playing it safe, and sit down, glancing around a little bit to see if anyone's eyeing me. That's when I see her. At first, I almost didn't recognize her. Sitting at a table in the corner, there's this old woman. She's got the kind of face that you wouldn't think would belong to someone in their 20s, more like someone who's pushing 70 or even 80. She's got white, almost gray hair, glasses that sit too high on her nose, and a smile that seems a little too wide for comfort. She waves at me like she knows me, and I do a double take. I'm not sure what I'm feeling at this point. A little confused, honestly, but still thinking there's some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe she's a regular here. I stand up and walk over to her, but the second I get close enough, she stands up, smiles, and says, "Hi, I'm Diana." Now, I'm not great at reading people, but at this moment, I can feel my stomach twist. I look at her, then glance at her profile on my phone for a second, just to double check. The woman sitting in front of me has none of the features that the girl in her photos had. No way. This wasn't the same person. She laughs a little like she's reading my mind and says something along the lines of, I know, you must be wondering what happened. The photos were just AI images I used to make myself look younger. I missed the dating scene, you know. I could feel my blood start to boil. At first, I just stare at her, processing what she just said. The shock of it hits me like a truck, and before I know it, I can't stop the words from coming out. You gotta be kidding me, I say, my voice louder than I expected. You seriously catfished me. Are you joking right now? You're not even close to what you showed me. Diana just sits there, still smiling like it's all some big joke. She doesn't even seem embarrassed, which somehow makes it worse. At this point, I feel that heat rising in my chest, and I'm just angry. Really angry. I can't believe I got sucked into this. I was expecting someone cute and fun, someone who might actually be real, but instead I got this. I don't know what possessed me, but I started walking away. I didn't even wait for her to say anything else. The whole thing felt like a bad dream. I could hear her calling after me, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get the hell out of there. But as I was walking out the door, I felt like someone had just pulled the rug out from under me. The whole situation felt off in a way I couldn't explain, like the world had shifted just enough to make me second guess everything I thought I knew. I couldn't stop thinking about how someone could do that, fake everything just to get someone to show up. Was she even who she said she was? I'm not proud of how I handled it. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should have stayed, listened to her explanation, whatever that would have been. But at that moment, all I wanted was to get as far away from that Starbucks as possible. So I did. I don't know what made me agree to go on that hike. I wasn't even the type of person who went hiking all that much. I mean, sure, I liked the idea of it. Fresh air, beautiful views, nature, and all that. But the whole let's go for a walk in the woods thing was just never my vibe. But Thomas, the guy I'd been chatting with online for the past few weeks, was insistent. I met him on a hiking group chat, and we hit it off pretty quickly. He seemed normal at first. We talked about outdoor stuff, shared some pictures of trails we liked, and joked about how we were both terrible at packing snacks for long trips. It all seemed fun and harmless until I agreed to go with him. We planned to meet at a local trailhead that was pretty popular. It wasn't a huge, well-known spot like some of the national parks, but it had its share of people who loved the outdoors. He picked the time, and I was there a little early, trying not to look too obvious as I waited. When he showed up, he looked different than I expected. He had that look about him, the kind of guy who spends way too much time in the gym and isn't shy about letting you know. But his eyes were what caught me off guard. They were too intense, like he was always staring right at you, like he could see through you. Maybe I just didn't want to read too much into it, but something felt off. Still, I shrugged it off. It was just a hike, right? I wasn't about to let some weird vibes get in the way of a fun afternoon. We started up the trail, and it was a little awkward at first, but that's pretty normal when you're meeting someone new. It's always a little strange trying to find a rhythm with someone you've only ever talked to online. At first, it was just small talk, where we were from, what we did for work, the usual stuff. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more it felt like there was something off about the whole thing. For one, he didn't let me choose a trail. He kept saying that the more isolated paths were better. I mean, sure, I get it, but I didn't think we were going to hike 5 miles just to avoid a few people. It felt weird, but I went along with it. It was too late to back out anyway. As we went deeper into the woods, the sounds around us started to fade. It wasn't just the usual forest sounds, the birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. This felt different. It was like the forest was holding its breath, and so was I. We were way off any main trail now, just wandering through trees and brush, and I started to wonder if we'd gone too far. And then I saw it, the first sign nailed to a tree. It was a piece of wood crudely painted with dark letters. It's better this way. My stomach did a flip. It wasn't a message that made sense, but more like a warning. I thought I imagined it at first, like maybe I was just tired from the walk, but no, it was real. I looked over at Thomas, who didn't even seem to notice the sign. He was just pushing forward, his pace picking up like he was in a hurry to get somewhere. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I kept walking. A few more steps and we came across another one. This one was nailed to a tree a few feet ahead of me, and the message was even worse. You're mine now. I stopped it in my tracks. That one was hard to ignore. My heart started pounding and my head was racing. What the hell was going on? The words burned into my brain. My body was telling me to turn around, but I didn't. I should have, but I didn't. Thomas turned to me then, smiling like he didn't notice how much my expression had changed. He said something about how we were almost to the clearing, that there was something cool I needed to see. His voice was calm, but his eyes were still too intense. I just nodded, barely hearing what he was saying as I tried to calm myself down. When we reached the clearing, that's when it really hit me. It wasn't just the signs, it was everything. There were more of them now, more signs nailed to the trees. Some were just random phrases, but others were specific. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen in a normal hiking trail. One read, "They'll understand soon enough." Another one was nailed to the biggest tree in the center, and it just said, "I'm waiting for you." There was something so wrong about it that I couldn't put my finger on it. My stomach was in knots, and all I could think about was how I needed to get out of there, but I didn't know how to leave without making it even more awkward. I tried to keep my voice steady when I asked him about the signs. I wanted to act normal, like I wasn't freaking out on the inside. I just needed to know what they were all about. But Thomas didn't answer at first. Instead, he just looked at me, and that's when I felt the air change around us. It wasn't just the signs anymore, it was the way he was looking at me. It was like he wasn't just seeing me, he was watching me, like I was a part of something. And then he said, "They'll understand soon enough." I didn't wait around to hear anything else. Something snapped in me, and without even thinking, I turned around and started running. I didn't know where I was going, just anywhere that wasn't there. The sound of my feet crashing through the underbrush was the only thing I could hear, and I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, thank God. I didn't even look back. I don't know what Thomas was up to, or what that whole thing was about, but I never saw him again after that. I blocked him on everything. The weird thing, a couple of weeks later, I started hearing rustling noises at night, right outside my house. It sounds too close to be a random animal. When I check, there's nothing there. The first date seemed pretty typical, nothing special or out of the ordinary, but definitely nothing that made me think it was going to turn into something unsettling. I met Jenna online, and we'd been chatting for a couple of weeks. Honestly, everything seemed pretty chill. We talked about everything from our favorite music to weird hobbies we both shared. So when she suggested going to this quiet little bar downtown, I figured why not. It was a Friday night and I wasn't doing anything else. When I walked in, Jenna was already there. I could spot her easily. She was sitting by the window, scrolling at her phone, looking just like her photos. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I felt a little relief that she didn't look anything like one of those fake profiles you see online. She was pretty, but not in a way that screamed Instagram model or anything. Just a normal girl with an easy smile and kind eyes. We got a drink and settled into a booth, and things were going pretty well at first. The conversation flowed naturally, and the atmosphere was perfect. It was a busy night at the bar, so we could hear each other talk without shouting over a crowd. I started to relax, and we got into some deeper subjects, life, our pasts, random funny stories from childhood. It felt easy. But about halfway through the night, I started to notice something strange. Jenna was starting to take a lot of selfies. At first, it was casual, like, I get it, people like their selfies. I wasn't bothered when she asked if we could snap a picture together for memory's sake. I'm not exactly a selfie person, but whatever, no big deal. I even smiled and posed a little. But then it started to get weird. She pulled out her phone again, just as I was taking a sip of my drink. I thought maybe she just wanted another cute photo, but then she did it a second time and a third. Every time she snapped a photo, it was at a different angle. First, it was me smiling with a drink in my hand. Then it was me leaning back in the booth, and then, even weirder, it was when I was looking away, staring at the TV across the bar. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was just having fun. I figured I'd just let her do her thing. But it kept happening. Every time I looked down at my drink or glanced around, she'd pull out her phone and snap another shot. At first, I laughed it off. I even joked about how I must be her personal photographer now, since I was getting so many pictures taken of me. But after a while, it felt more like she was just trying to get the perfect shot of me without me even realizing. I started to get this weird, uncomfortable feeling in my gut. I tried to ignore it, not wanting to make a big deal out of something so small. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe she was just into documenting the night or something. I don't know. But when she started taking photos of me while I wasn't looking, really trying to catch me in moments when I was just doing something normal, like sipping my drink or talking to her, it started to feel like a bit much. The rest of the date was fine, or at least I thought so. We talked a bit more, and I tried to steer the conversation away from awkward silences. At the end of the night, we said our goodbyes, and I went home. I figured I'd just forget about the selfies and not make it into something bigger. But then a few days later, I was scrolling through social media, mindlessly checking my feed. And that's when I saw it, Jenna's account. I hadn't followed her, but her account popped up because we had a few mutual friends. And there they were, the photos. They weren't tagged or even credited, but there I was on her page. It started off with a selfie she'd taken when we first sat down. Nothing too weird. But then there were the others. The photos she'd taken when I wasn't paying attention, me drinking, me looking down, me with a distracted look on my face while she snapped pictures from behind the table. And the more I scrolled, the weirder it got. One of the pictures was even worse. It looked like she'd secretly filmed me when I wasn't looking. I could tell because the quality was lower than the regular photos, and it was a weird angle, almost like she had the camera hidden under the table. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was seeing. She had filmed me without my consent. That thought hit me like a punch in the gut. It wasn't just selfies anymore. It was like she was collecting moments of me without my knowledge. I thought about reaching out to her, but something told me to hold off. So I just left a comment on one of the pictures. A simple, "Hey, cool photo. Why didn't you tag me or give me credit?" I didn't want to sound accusing, but I needed to know if she'd acknowledge it. I didn't expect an immediate reply, but she did get back to me pretty quickly. Her response was simple. She said something like, "Oh, I didn't tag you because I didn't think it was a big deal. It's just pictures from the night. I'm sorry if you didn't like them." I tried to play it cool, but I was getting this sick feeling in my stomach. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd taken those photos of me when I wasn't even aware. It wasn't like just snapping a picture for a cute moment. It felt more like a weird, almost manipulative thing, like she was trying to control how I looked, how it was seen, or even how I existed in her world. I confronted her again about the video footage. This time, she just got defensive. It wasn't a big deal, she said. I was just having fun. But that didn't explain the strange angles, the secret filming. There was no way it was just fun. It felt calculated. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't. The photos still popped up here and there on her profile shared by friends. And the weird thing, there was no telling how far those pictures and videos had spread. Had she shown them to other people? Had they gone viral? I had no clue. The whole thing was unsettling, and even now I can't stop thinking about it. Was she just some quirky girl who loved taking photos, or was there something darker lurking behind her smile? I'll never really know, but every time I think about those pictures, I can't help but wonder how much of my life she's documented without me ever knowing. I've never been a fan of blind dates. It's just not something I ever saw as a good idea. But when my friend Sarah swore up and down that Luke and I would hit it off, I decided to give it a shot. I mean, Sarah was my best friend. If anyone knew what I liked in a guy, it was her. She was convinced Luke and I were perfect for each other. So with some hesitation, I agreed. The date was set for a cozy little bistro in town, one of those places that always has that perfect dim lighting, a small but fancy menu, and a wine list that makes you feel like you're actually an adult for once. I showed up early just to make sure I wasn't late. The last thing I wanted was to look like I was dragging my feet into this thing. And when Luke finally walked in, I wasn't sure what I expected, but he was fine. Tall, good-looking enough with a decent smile that made him seem approachable. His hair was a little messy in that way that girls usually find cute, and he had this laid-back vibe to him that made me think we'd probably have a good conversation. At first, everything seemed normal. We chatted about the usual stuff, the weather, where we'd grown up, what we were into. Luke seemed like a good conversationalist, and I was relieved that it wasn't one of those awkward silences where both of you are just trying to think of something to say. He was nice, charming even. But as the night went on, the conversation started to take a weird turn. I'm not sure when it started, but somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, he mentioned his ex. It wasn't anything too crazy at first, just a quick reference to a relationship that didn't work out. And I thought, okay, that's fine. Exes are a part of life, and I wasn't going to hold it against him. But then it didn't stop. He kept talking about his exes, one after the other. He told me about his first girlfriend, how they had some good times, but she wasn't the one. Then he went into detail about another ex, the one that really screwed him over. And that's when things started getting uncomfortable. He described everything in graphic detail, like I was supposed to feel sorry for him or relate somehow. The way he talked about his exes wasn't just casual conversation. It was like he was venting or unloading some deep-seated resentment that he had never processed. It wasn't just the breakups that he was talking about. It was the intimate details, the personal preferences, the things that should have stayed private. And it wasn't just one ex, it was every single one of them. He went on for almost an hour, nonstop, painting this picture of women who had betrayed him in one way or another. At some point, I started zoning out. I didn't even know how to respond. I could feel myself getting more uncomfortable with each word. He spoke about his last girlfriend, how she'd ruined his life, and how every woman just seems to screw him over in the end. The way he talked about her like she was a villain, it made me uneasy. But he didn't just stop there. He went on about his troubles with women, his issues with commitment, and how he felt like they always left him for someone better. It was as if I was supposed to sympathize with him, but I didn't. I sat there, nodding along, trying to keep my face neutral. I wasn't sure what to do or say. The whole thing felt like an overload of personal information. Like he was airing out every piece of emotional baggage he had in one go, and I was the unfortunate recipient of it. I kept looking at the time, hoping the dinner would end soon, but it felt like it was dragging on forever. All I wanted to do was leave, but I didn't want to be rude. I didn't know what to say to get out of it. It wasn't like I hadn't been on awkward dates before, but this was different. It was like he didn't even realize how inappropriate he was being, how much he was oversharing. It was clear that he had a lot of unresolved issues, and somehow I was now the person he was unloading all of them onto. It made me wonder if he did this with every woman he met. Was this his go-to conversation on a first date, to just get it all off his chest? Finally, when we finished our meals, I politely made my exit. I thanked him for the date, but I had just survived a verbal assault on my personal space. I was glad it was over, or so I thought. The next day, I blocked his number. I didn't want to deal with him anymore. And honestly, I didn't want to feel obligated to be nice. He had crossed a boundary, and I wasn't interested in trying to make it work. But here's the thing. Even though I blocked him, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if I'd missed something. Had I just dodged a major red flag? I mean, maybe it wasn't his fault. Maybe he just needed someone to listen to him. But there's a fine line between venting and oversharing. And after everything he said about how women betrayed him, I couldn't help but feel like I had been a target of sorts, like it was just another woman to add to his list of problems. I didn't feel like I was being paranoid, but I also couldn't ignore how unsettling it was that he thought it was okay to pour out such personal, graphic details of his past relationships with a complete stranger. I mean, how could someone feel like comfortable doing that on a first date? It wasn't just the content, it was the casualness with which he said it, like it was no big deal at all. I still think about that night sometimes. I wonder if he genuinely thought he was just telling his story, or if he was testing me in some way. Maybe he didn't see how it might come across. But to me, it was a massive red flag. It wasn't just about his exes. It was about his attitude toward women, his bitterness. It made me wonder what he thought about me when he looked at me across the table. Honestly, I don't think I'll ever fully understand why he chose to talk to me the way he did. But I'm glad I listened to my gut and got out of there when I did. Because if I'd ignored that feeling of discomfort, I might have ended up in an even worse situation. And that's a thought that still gives me chills. I still think about the night I met Chris. It's funny how one small moment can stick with you forever, especially when you realize it wasn't what you thought it was. If you'd asked me that day, I would have said the date went great. We met at a cafe, just your typical first date setup. I've been talking to him online for a few days and everything seemed fine. He was charming, easy to talk to, and seemed to get along with me. We had coffee, chatted about random stuff, and laughed a lot. Honestly, I thought we hit it off pretty well, but that's when things took a turn. After a while, Chris suggested we go to a local park nearby. It sounded nice enough, just a quiet place to walk around and talk more. So we left the cafe and made our way there. It was early evening, the sun just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The park was pretty empty, and there was this peaceful, almost eerie silence that felt different from the usual hustle of the city. We found a bench to sit on, just the two of us. At first, everything seemed fine. We were talking about all sorts of stuff, still joking around like we had been at the cafe. But then something strange happened. A woman walked by maybe 20 feet from where we were sitting. I'd noticed her just a normal passerby, but Chris didn't. He went completely still like a statue. His eyes were locked on her, and his expression, I don't know how to describe it. It was like he was frozen in time. I glanced at him, thinking it was odd, but I didn't ask about it right away. I didn't want to make it weird, but I couldn't help but feel like something was off. The woman walked past us, and I thought that would be the end of it, but no. The second she was out of sight, Chris stood up abruptly, like he couldn't sit still anymore. It was so sudden, so out of nowhere that I almost jumped. He didn't say anything at first, just kind of stared ahead, looking really distracted. I asked him what was going on, but he just ignored me like he didn't even hear me. Then he said, almost in a rush, that we needed to leave. It didn't make sense, but I figured maybe something was bothering him. I stood up to follow him, still feeling that weird tension in the air, and he started walking fast toward his car. We didn't even walk back the way we came. He practically yanked me by the arm and led me down a side path, heading straight for the parking lot. I could feel his grip tightening on my arm, like he was almost in a hurry to get out of there. I was confused. What just happened? Why was he acting like this? It was like a switch flipped in him, and I had no clue why. Once we got his car, he didn't waste any time getting in. He told me to get in quickly, that we couldn't stay there anymore. He was so frantic. I could see his hands shaking as he started the car, and before I knew it, we were speeding out of the parking lot. The whole thing felt rushed and off, and my mind was racing. What the hell was going on? What had I missed? I didn't ask anything else. At this point, I just wanted to get out of whatever weird situation I'd found myself in. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, wondering if I should just go home. But it wasn't until I got back to my apartment later that night that I found out what had actually happened. As I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, I noticed something weird. One of my notifications popped up. It was a new post on Instagram. It was from a girl I didn't know, but she had tagged Chris in the post. I clicked on it, curious, and there it was, a photo of Chris smiling, standing next to the same woman I'd seen in the park earlier. The caption read, "I miss you." I stared at the picture, trying to process what I was seeing. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Chris had been acting like that because he recognized her. He knew her. And whatever was going on between them, it was clearly unresolved. I'd been dragged into a situation I didn't understand, and I felt like an idiot for not picking up on the signs earlier. It made sense now the way he froze up when she walked by. He was panicked, avoiding her, maybe even hiding the fact that they were still involved in some way. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that he had still been leading me on, acting like everything was fine, even though he had this whole other thing going on with her. I wasn't just some random date. He was seeing her, and clearly there was some unfinished business between them. And yet, here I was thinking it was all fine. I felt stupid, honestly. But more than that, I felt like I had been played. Chris had dragged me into something I didn't sign up for. And then when the woman showed up, he panicked and tried to cover his tracks. The thing is, I never heard from Chris again. Not once. He didn't text me, didn't call me, nothing. It was like he just vanished. And at first, I was a little upset, but after processing everything, I realized how much of a blessing that really was. He'd been lying to me from the start. I wasn't some random girl he was interested in. I was just someone to distract him for a night, to fill the space until he could get away from his real problems. I still think about that night sometimes, about the pit in my stomach when he panicked at the park. It was like a warning sign I ignored, and now I can't help but wonder how many other girls he did the same thing to. How many people got caught up in his web of lies without even realizing it? It's one of those things that you look back on and wish you could have known sooner. I don't even know if he was still with her by the time we met, but it didn't matter. The way he handled it, the way he tried to hide it from me, made everything feel wrong. I narrowly escaped something far worse than a bad date, and it still messes with my head to think that, for a brief moment, I was a part of whatever mess he was hiding. So dinner at a cozy little place downtown, followed by a casual walk around the park. Nothing too fancy, nothing out of the ordinary. Mark seemed like a good guy. He was funny, easy to talk to, and I felt comfortable around him, which is rare for me. The night ended with the usual goodbye, and I figured that was it. I didn't think much of it, to be honest. But then the texts started. At first, they were harmless. Sweet even. He said he had a great time, told me he couldn't wait to see me again. The usual stuff, right? I didn't think anything of it because, honestly, what was wrong with a guy being nice? I didn't have any red flags at that point. He was just being polite. Maybe a little eager, but nothing too creepy. It felt normal, at least at first. But then the messages started to change. Little by little, things became off. At first, it was a text here and there referencing something we talked about on the date. Hey, hope you got home okay. Or, did you end up getting that coffee you wanted? Simple stuff. But then one morning, I woke up to a message that made my stomach drop. It wasn't just the usual hope you're doing well kind of text. It was more like, I saw you at the coffee shop this morning. You looked tired. You didn't look like you wanted to be there. It was a weird thing to say, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he'd seen me there without meaning to, and he was just being observant. But then it kept happening. Every day, I started getting these random texts. I saw you at the gym this afternoon, didn't know you work out at that time. Or, I'd noticed you took the long way home today, didn't you? I was wondering if you had something on your mind. I started getting that feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I wasn't in control of this situation anymore. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just being kind of attentive. I mean, maybe it was just a weird coincidence, right? But then when he started texting me about my work schedule, things took a much darker turn. I didn't tell him where I worked, but somehow he knew. He'd send me messages like, I know you work late tonight. Be careful driving home. Or, you must be exhausted from your shift today, huh? I could feel my heart start racing every time I read those texts. How did he know my schedule? And how did he know where I was all the time? It didn't make sense. I tried to confront him about it once, asking how he knew about my work hours. He apologized immediately, saying he was just observant, and that it was nothing to worry about. He assured me he wasn't stalking me or anything, but I didn't buy it. It felt like he was trying to convince me that the thing that made me uncomfortable wasn't a big deal. Still, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. I figured maybe he was just being overenthusiastic. Maybe he liked me and was trying to be nice. But then the worst thing happened. I came home one afternoon to find a note in my mailbox. It wasn't a letter from anyone I knew, and when I opened it, I could tell immediately it was written in Mark's handwriting. I could see it. His signature scribble, the same one he'd used when he'd written me a little note on the date. The note was short, but it chilled me to the bone. I've been following you for a while now. I know where you go, what you do, and I've been watching. I'll always be close, just so you know. It was like someone had poured ice water over my head. I stood there in the hallway, holding the note, staring at it for what felt like hours. But in reality, it was probably just a few minutes. My mind raced. How did he know where I lived? How did he know my routine so well? I thought I had blocked him from all my social media. I thought I was being careful. But this note, this proved that he had been watching me. Suddenly, everything felt like it was slipping out of my control. I blocked him everywhere I could think of. Text messages, Instagram, Facebook, everything. But part of me knew that blocking him didn't really solve the problem. If he'd already been following me without my knowledge, what was stopping him from showing up at my work or my apartment again? The next few days were a blur. I started double-checking my locks, looking over my shoulder whenever I went out, and even started taking a different route home. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, expecting it to be him. But after I blocked him, the texts stopped. The phone calls never came. I thought maybe I was finally safe. But I still didn't feel safe. I didn't feel at ease, and I couldn't shake the image of that note. It haunted me, and I found myself constantly wondering what else Mark knew. I thought I could put it behind me, but I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that someone I barely knew had been keeping such a close eye on me. I ended up moving a few months later. I didn't tell anyone why, but I just didn't feel comfortable staying in the same place anymore. The idea that Mark could have been watching me from somewhere nearby was something I couldn't ignore. Even now, sometimes when I'm walking around town or in a crowded place, I'll get that feeling, the one that's so hard to shake, like someone's watching me. It could just be my imagination, but I don't think I'll ever really feel safe again. And I'll never forget the moment I realized just how much Mark had been watching me. The part of me that wonders if he knows where I am now, even though I'm hundreds of miles away. It started as a normal date, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I met Olivia through a mutual friend, and we decided to grab dinner at a local place that wasn't too busy, just a chill spot to get to know each other. I'd heard a lot of good things about her, and when we met, she seemed cool. She had this kind of soft-spoken charm that made her easy to talk to. We had a decent time at first, chatting about our favorite movies, music, and random things like that. But as the night went on, I couldn't help but notice something was off. At first, it was subtle. Every so often, I'd catch her glancing at her phone, but she never seemed to respond to any of the notifications. I thought maybe she was just being polite, not wanting to seem distracted. I mean, I was guilty of checking my phone sometimes too. But this was different. She was doing it more often. It wasn't like she was just looking at it and putting it down. She'd glance at it, then immediately look away, almost like she didn't want me to see what was on her screen. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe it was nothing, right? Maybe she just had a lot going on. But as the night went on, her energy shifted. She started pulling away from the conversation a little, and it was hard to ignore. We were talking about something, and she seemed to zone out, staring into space for a second. I didn't say anything about it, but it felt like she wasn't really there anymore. At one point, she excused herself to take a quick call in the bathroom. I didn't think much of it. People get busy, I get it. But after she left, I noticed her phone was still on the table, face up. I couldn't help it. I looked at the screen. There wasn't anything super weird at first glance, just a few text notifications from people I didn't recognize, but then there was one that caught my attention. It was from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. He's watching you. Stay safe. My heart skipped a beat. I don't know what I expected to see, but it definitely wasn't that. The text wasn't meant for me, I knew that, but the fact that it was on her phone, her personal phone, made me feel uneasy. Why would someone be telling her that? Who was watching who? I quickly put the phone back down like I hadn't seen anything, and tried to calm myself down. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was some random message or a prank, But even as I convinced myself not to think too much of it, I couldn't stop the weird feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. When Olivia came back from the bathroom, she was different. Her eyes seemed a little wider, her posture was stiffer. She wasn't as talkative as she had been before, and when I tried to start a conversation, she gave me these short, distracted answers. I asked if she was okay, but she just said she was fine. But she didn't look fine. She looked unsettled. The rest of the night went by in a blur. We finished our meals, and the conversation was awkward and forced, not at all like how it had been at the start. When the bill came, I paid like I always do on a first date. But honestly, I just wanted to get out of there. Something was off, and I couldn't put my finger on it. We both stood up to leave, and as we walked toward the exit, I noticed she kept looking around the restaurant like she was searching for something or someone. That's when I saw it. As I was walking behind her, I caught a glimpse of her phone screen. She had it in her hand, and for just a split second, I saw a new message notification pop up. I could barely read it, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. It said, "He's watching you. Stay safe." It was the same message I'd seen earlier. And Olivia saw me looking at her phone. She froze for a second, then quickly turned her screen face down and shoved it back into her purse, like she was trying to hide it from me. Her expression changed in an instant. Her face went pale, and she quickly turned away from me. She didn't say anything, but I could tell that she knew I had seen the message. I didn't say anything either. I didn't want to make it awkward or confront her, but I could feel my pulse racing. The whole vibe was wrong now. The air felt thick, like there was something I wasn't supposed to know, and I had just accidentally stumbled onto it. We made small talk as we walked outside, and I said goodbye, but it didn't feel like a normal goodbye. It felt like she was trying to get away from me as quickly as possible, almost like she was scared. That was the last time I saw Olivia. She didn't text me afterward, and I didn't text her. I could tell something was off with her, but I didn't want to push it. I never heard from her again, and I didn't try to reach out. But the weird part, the part that still haunts me, I keep wondering about that message. Who was watching me, or more importantly, who was watching her? Why would she get a text like that? And why was she hiding it from me? Was it some kind of crazy coincidence? Or did I just narrowly avoid something way more dangerous than a bad date? I don't know the answers, and to be honest, I don't think I ever will. I just know that I'll never forget the way Olivia acted after I saw that message. And I'll never forget the feeling that I had like I was being watched too. Even now when I walk through crowded places, I sometimes feel like someone's following me. It could just be my imagination, but I'll never be able to think about what happened that night wasn't just a coincidence. I met Yusuf online. It started off like any other online conversation. Friendly, lighthearted, nothing too serious. We swapped a few messages about our favorite shows, hobbies, and random things like that. I wasn't really expecting much from it. After all, we'd only been chatting for a couple of weeks, but when he suggested we meet up in person, I figured why not. A lot of people had met online and had perfectly normal first dates, so why should this be any different? We decided on a restaurant not far from where I lived. It was a quiet place, kind of fancy, but not too over the top. The atmosphere was nice, the kind of place you go to when you want to have a casual yet nice meal without it being too formal. When I arrived, Yusuf was already there. He looked like his pictures, tall, kind of handsome in a scruffy way, and a little nervous, but nothing out of the ordinary. We started talking, and at first, everything seemed fine. We shared a few laughs, talked about our days, and everything was going smoothly. But then things started to feel a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but Yusuf kept asking questions that seemed a little too personal for someone I'd just met. It wasn't the usual, "What do you do for a living?" Or "Do you have any pets?" It was stuff like, "What's your full name again?" And "Where do you live exactly?" I tried to brush it off, and he was just trying to make conversation or something. But the more he asked, the more it started to feel like he was trying to collect information, like he was a little too interested in my life. I remember thinking that maybe I was just overthinking things, and that he was just nervous or awkward. Everyone has a weird habit, right? But as the meal went on, it got even stranger. He started asking questions about my past, like stuff I wouldn't normally talk about on a first date. It wasn't that I minded sharing personal things, but it felt too soon. We hadn't even finished dessert, and he was asking me where I grew up, about my family, and how long I'd been living in the city. I just thought, okay, this guy's a little socially awkward, and that was it. I didn't want to be rude, so I answered him, but it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. After dinner, we left the restaurant, and I was glad to finally be out of that weird headspace. But that relief was short-lived. As we drove through the streets, I started to notice something. There was a car behind us. It wasn't following too closely, but it was definitely there. I didn't think much of it at first. It could have just been coincidence, right? Cars go the same way sometimes. But as we made turns, I noticed the car kept turning in the same direction. It was following us. I didn't say anything at first, trying to shake off the feeling that I was overreacting. But when we took a few more turns, and the car was still behind us, I started to get uncomfortable. The weird part was, Yusuf didn't seem to notice. He was chatting away like everything was normal, like I could feel my heart start to race. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but the car was always there, a little too far back to be coincidental, but still close enough to make me feel paranoid. I tried to casually mention it to him, but he shrugged it off, claiming it was just a coincidence. He said, "There are a lot of people on the road at this hour. Don't worry about it." He tried to sound reassuring, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. Eventually, we got to my place, and I thought I could finally relax. But as I got out of his car, I knew that something wasn't right. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, the same car was parked across the street. It wasn't in a parking spot or anything. It was just sitting there, idling like it was waiting for something. The car was too familiar. It was the same one that had been following us. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do. Yusuf hadn't even noticed it, but I wasn't about to let it slide. I told him thanks for the ride, and he left. I stood there for a second, staring at the car, trying to decide whether I should say something to him. But I didn't. Something in my gut told me it was better to keep it to myself. I hurried inside and locked all the doors. I tried to calm down, telling myself that maybe it was nothing. But just in case, I texted a friend to come over. I didn't want to be alone. I barely slept that night. Every time I thought I heard a noise outside, my heart would race. Every shadow in the street seemed like a threat. I kept watching the window, looking for that car, hoping I wouldn't see it again. The next morning, I woke up to a text. It was from an unknown number. I didn't recognize it, but I opened it anyway. It read, "Next time we'll have more fun." My blood ran cold. I blocked the number immediately, but I had the feeling that Yusuf had something to do with it. I never saw him again after that night. I stopped responding to his texts and deleted his number. But that car, I swear, I see it around sometimes. It's always parked somewhere, a little too close to my street. I'll drive past, and every so often, I'll spot it again. Always at a distance, never too close, but always there. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't help but wonder if I narrowly escaped something worse that night. I still don't know who was behind that car, or who sent that text, but I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. I guess it's true what they say. Sometimes a gut feeling is all you need to know something's off. And I'm just hoping that whoever it is will stay far away. I met Darren through a dating app, and after a few weeks of texting, we decided to meet up at a local cafe. I thought it would be just like any other casual first date, grab a coffee, talk, get to know each other a little better, and see if there was any chemistry. I had my guard up like I always do with people I meet online, but honestly, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. When I arrived at the cafe, Darren was already there, sitting at a small table by the window. He looked like his pictures, kind of tall, casually dressed, nothing too fancy, and there was this calm, easy vibe about him that made me think, okay, maybe this won't be so bad. We talked about all the usual stuff, work, hobbies, music, travel, all the things you talk about when you don't really know someone but want to fill the silence. The conversation was flowing pretty naturally, and I was actually enjoying myself. As the date went on, Darren seemed like a decent guy. Nothing particularly weird stood out, and we even shared a few laughs. But then, about an hour or so into the date, he got quiet, like really quiet. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just tired or something, but it felt different. I kept trying to make small talk, but he seemed distracted, like his mind was elsewhere. It wasn't until the bill came that I realized something was off. When the waiter dropped the check off at our table, Darren looked at it for a moment, then glanced up at me with a kind of uncomfortable look on his face. It wasn't the "I don't want to pay for this" look, but something was definitely wrong. I thought he might have just been broke or didn't want to pay for the whole meal or something. But what happened next caught me completely off guard. He told me he'd lost his wallet. At first, I didn't believe him. It didn't make sense. We'd just been talking for the past couple of hours, and he seemed completely normal. But suddenly, he's claiming he's got his wallet. I thought he was joking or maybe trying to test me, but he didn't laugh, didn't make a big deal out of it. He just sat there looking awkward, almost pleading. Now, I didn't want to make a scene. I'd been raised to be polite, even in uncomfortable situations, and since I didn't want to embarrass him, I agreed to pay for it. I mean, I had my wallet on me, and it wasn't a huge amount to cover, so whatever, no big deal. I figured I'd pay now, and we could laugh about it later. But as I reached for my bag to grab my wallet, something immediately felt off. It wasn't that my wallet wasn't there, it was that the bag was open. I always keep my bag zipped up when I'm out, especially in places like that. So I knew for sure that I hadn't left it open. My heart started to race a little. I took a quick look inside, and that's when I saw it. My wallet was gone. I froze for a second. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I also knew something wasn't right. I tried to stay calm, but the first thought that ran through my mind was that Darren had somehow taken it. I didn't want to accuse him right there in front of the waiter, but I couldn't ignore the gut feeling I had that something shady was going on. I confronted him, though not as directly as I probably should have. I asked if he'd seen my wallet or if he knew where it went. Darren looked just as confused as I felt, but he wasn't panicking like I was. He didn't seem stressed at all, like it wasn't even an issue for him. He kept repeating that he'd lost his wallet and that he didn't know what happened to it. His calmness was unsettling. At that point, I couldn't just sit there anymore. I paid for the meal, trying not to let my anxiety show. Darren promised he'd pay me back. I wasn't convinced. The whole situation felt weird, and the more I thought about it, the less I trusted him. I didn't want to make a scene, but I definitely wanted out of that cafe. I said my goodbyes, and he didn't try to stop me, which was odd too. If I'd lost my wallet after a date, I'd probably at least try to make it right, but he didn't seem to care. After I left, I was all kinds of shaken up. I didn't want to jump to conclusions and accuse him of something I couldn't prove, but when I got home, I double-checked my bag again. Sure enough, my wallet was still gone. I was furious, but I tried to put it out of my mind for a little bit. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really was a coincidence, and my wallet had just slipped out without me noticing. But then the next day, I got a call from my bank. My stomach dropped when they told me there had been some unusual charges on my account, charges I definitely didn't make. The weirdest part, one of the charges was at the exact same restaurant Darren and I had gone to the night before. I don't know how it all went down, but at that moment, I was 100% sure what had happened. Darren had taken my wallet, and now he was using it without any care in the world. I spent the rest of the day trying to cancel cards, file reports, and block any further charges, but I couldn't get the feeling out of my head that Darren had been playing me from the start. I tried calling him a few times to confront him, but he never answered. I sent a few texts asking about the charges, but I got nothing back. Days went by, and I didn't hear from him again. The whole thing felt like a setup. He had probably been planning to steal from me the entire time, and I had just been too trusting to see it. A few weeks went by, and I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I blocked him, moved on, and didn't think much more about it. But the weirdest part, I still wonder how much he knew about me. How did he know where I lived? How did he know the exact restaurant I'd been at? Was I being watched before the date even started? I don't know, maybe I'll never know. But what I do know is that I learned a valuable lesson that night. Not everyone online is who they say they are. And that sometimes the red flags are there from the very start, but it's easy to ignore them until it's too late. It started off as any normal first date would. I met Eliza through a mutual friend, and we decided to grab dinner at this cozy little restaurant downtown. The place had a charming vibe, dim lighting, soft music in the background, and an intimate atmosphere that made it feel like the kind of place you could have a good conversation without any distractions. We hit it off right away, laughing and talking about everything from our favorite movies to random childhood memories. Thought it was going really well. But then, halfway through the meal, something shifted. It wasn't a big dramatic change, just a subtle shift that I couldn't ignore. Eliza suddenly went completely quiet, like dead silent. She wasn't eating, she wasn't looking at her phone, she just stared at her plate, almost like she was in another world. I waited a few minutes, thinking maybe she was just processing something, but it went on and on. It was a little uncomfortable. I tried to keep the conversation going, asking her how her day was, what kind of stuff she liked to do in her free time, but she didn't seem to hear me. It was like she wasn't even present in the moment anymore. I didn't want to make things worse by acting weird or pushing too hard, but I couldn't sit there in silence much longer, so I asked her if everything was okay. She finally looked up at me, almost like she hadn't realized I was talking to her. She said she was just thinking, and then went back to staring at her plate. I figured maybe she had something on her mind, so I left it at that. But it didn't get better. The silence between us stretched on, and I started feeling more and more awkward, wondering if I had said something wrong or if I'd done something to upset her. I tried a few more times to keep the conversation going, asking more questions, trying to be lighthearted to break the tension, but nothing worked. She was disengaged, just staring into space, her eyes almost glassy. It felt like I was talking to a wall. I didn't know if it was me or if she was just having a bad night, but either way, I felt like an idiot trying to keep the conversation alive when she clearly wasn't interested. Despite the uncomfortable silence, I didn't want to just up and leave. It was only a first date, and I felt like I should at least try to make the best of it. So I decided to stick it out and ordered dessert. I figured a sweet treat might lighten the mood. But that didn't help either. I didn't expect her to suddenly snap out of it, but I hoped maybe the sugar would help bring her back to reality. But no, the silence just kept dragging on, even when the dessert arrived. She barely touched it, and I could tell she was somewhere else entirely. I thought about asking her if she wanted to leave, but I didn't want to make it worse by sounding like I was rushing her. I just sat there, poking at my dessert, wondering how long I had to sit through this before I could just go home. I guess I should have known something was off, but I tried to tell myself that maybe she was just having a bad night. Maybe she had something personal going on. Maybe she wasn't feeling it, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But it felt more like something was wrong, like she wasn't even there anymore. It felt like I was on a date with a ghost. Eventually, when the check came, I tried to pay, but she didn't move. She didn't make any attempt to reach for her wallet or offer to split the bill, which was strange given how we'd been chatting earlier. She didn't even acknowledge the waiter when he dropped off the bill. When I stood up to leave, she suddenly stood up too, almost as if she had been waiting for me to make the first move. As I started walking toward the door, she said something that I didn't fully process at first. It felt like a punch to the gut. "I think you're not the one," she said, and just walked out of the restaurant without another word. I stood there frozen for a second, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was that supposed to be some sort of weird and dramatic exit? I didn't get it. I wanted to say something, ask her what the hell she meant, but I was too stunned to do anything. She just left. I don't know what I expected after that, but I didn't expect it to be the end of everything. She didn't text me the next day or anything. I didn't get any explanation, no closure, nothing. I figured maybe she was just really awkward or had a bad night. It's been weeks now, and I still haven't heard from her. I thought about reaching out, but something told me it would be pointless. It's like she just disappeared, and I was left to figure out what the hell had just happened. I keep replaying that night in my head over and over. What went wrong? What caused that sudden shift in her behavior? Was it me? Was she just not into me? Or was there something else going on with her that she wasn't telling me? It's strange because at first, things seemed so normal. The whole night felt like it was going well, and then out of nowhere, it felt like she completely checked out. It was like I wasn't even there anymore. I didn't know what was happening in her mind, but I definitely got the sense that something wasn't right. And maybe that's the weirdest part. The lack of explanation, the abruptness of it all. It wasn't just the fact that she left, it was how she left. The coldness, the way she didn't even look back, like it was nothing. I can't help but wonder what was going on with her that night. And as much as I want to forget about it, there's this nagging feeling in my head that I can't shake. What if there's more to it than just a bad date? Maybe I'll never know. But it definitely makes me question whether I dodged a bullet or if something much stranger was at play. I still think about the night I went on that date with Julian. It wasn't supposed to be anything weird. We had dinner at this cozy little Italian place downtown, the kind with the dim lighting and quiet corners. Everything seemed fine, at least at first. Julian was polite, easy to talk to, and we shared a lot of laughs. But I should have known things weren't going to stay normal. After dinner, He suggested we take a walk through a nearby park. I wasn't really in the mood, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. Just a nice way to stretch our legs after a filling meal. We walked along the path, making small talk about random stuff. At first, it felt like any other evening, just two people walking and talking, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, out of nowhere, we bumped into a woman. She was standing off to the side of the path, looking like she was on the verge of tears. She wasn't crying, but her face was pale and her eyes were red, like she had been upset for a while. I didn't know what to think at first. It was one of those situations where you're just kind of standing there, unsure of what's going on. Julian stepped forward like he knew exactly who she was. I guess he did, because as soon as she saw him, she looked relieved, like she'd been waiting for him. It was strange. I stood off to the side, not really sure if I was supposed to say anything, or if I was even part of the situation at all. They exchanged a few words, but I couldn't really hear them. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out, and I didn't want to eavesdrop, so I just waited, feeling like I was intruding on something personal. After a minute, Julian turned to me, smiling in this weird way, like everything was totally fine. He introduced me to the woman, calling her his friend. It wasn't weird that he had a friend, but it felt odd that he'd been so quick to help her. There was something about the way she looked at him, almost like she was depending on him for something more than just comfort. The whole situation was off. I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't think too much about it in the moment. The woman didn't say much. She just nodded, gave me a polite smile, and then walked off in the direction we had just come from. Julian watched her for a second, his eyes focused, but once she was out of sight, he turned to me with his completely cold expression. Like the guy I've been talking to for the last few hours wasn't even there anymore. And then, in a way that I can still hear in my head, he said, "Don't ever talk about this night again. We'll see if you're worth it." I didn't know what to say to that. I was confused, unsettled, and a little freaked out. His tone wasn't playful. It wasn't like he was joking around. He sounded serious. And for a moment, I thought about asking him what he meant, but I was so caught off guard, I just nodded and said nothing. I don't know what I expected him to do next, but he just turned and started walking without another word. At that point, I had no clue what was going on, but something felt off. I wanted to ask more questions, but he wasn't giving me any answers. So I just followed him out of the park, thinking about how weird everything had gotten in the past 5 minutes. I didn't want to make it into something bigger than it was, so I chalked it up to just a strange moment. Maybe he was just having an off day, or maybe he'd been caught up in something personal that I didn't understand. Still, the feeling of unease stuck with me as I left that night. And then a few weeks later, I saw Julian again. It was at a coffee shop this time, and when I walked in, there he was, sitting with the same woman from the park. I froze. For a moment, I thought I was seeing things, but no, it was definitely her. They were sitting close, laughing together like they were more than just friends. Julian didn't seem to notice me at first, but when he did, he gave me this smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't know what to think. It was so messed up. I had no idea what kind of game he was playing, but it was clear now that there was something I wasn't being told. The woman, who I now realized wasn't just some random person, but someone close to him, didn't even glance my way. It was like they were in their own world, and I was just this awkward outsider. I couldn't help but feel like I was being played. The whole situation just felt wrong. I remembered that night in the park, and the way he had looked at me after she left, and the weird warning he gave me. I felt like I was stuck in the middle of something I didn't understand, and now I was left with more questions than answers. I didn't approach them. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked out, my mind racing with all the possible scenarios. Maybe I was just a pawn in whatever this was. Maybe he had invited me out to see how I'd react to this woman, or maybe he was just toying with me for reasons I couldn't figure out. It's been a while, but I still wonder what that whole night was about. What was the deal with the woman? Why had Julian been so cold and distant after she left? And what did he mean by, "we'll see if you're worth it"? I never heard from him again after that. He didn't try to reach out, and I didn't try to reach out either. But every time I think back to that night, I can't help but feel like something shady was going on. I don't know if it was a test or a game or something darker, but whatever it was, I'm glad I never found out. I just wish I knew what the hell happened that night, and what it all meant. So, here's the thing. I met Trevor on a dating app. I know, that's where everything usually starts to go downhill, right? But this was different, or at least it seemed that way. He seemed like a decent guy at first. Nice conversations, easy to talk to, and we had a lot of things in common. After a few weeks of chatting, we decided to meet up. Honestly, I was excited. I hadn't felt this kind of spark in a while, so maybe, just maybe, it could be something good. We picked a nice little cafe downtown, one of those places with a cozy atmosphere, soft jazz music in the background, and some cool vintage decor. When I got there, Trevor was already sitting at a table, looking just like his pictures. Tall, a little scruffy, but in a good way. I walked up to him, said hello, and sat down. We started chatting, and it was going fine. Nothing weird, just the usual stuff, where we're from, what we do for work, random small talk. At first, it felt like it could be one of those smooth, perfect first dates. But then things started to shift. After about 30 minutes, Trevor started checking his phone. It wasn't a quick glance either. He was staring at it, frowning, then typing a few things, then staring at it again. I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to keep the conversation going, but it felt like I was talking to a wall. Every time I asked him something or made a joke, he didn't really respond the way he had been. He just kept looking down at his phone like there was something urgent going on. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, but it started to feel like I wasn't the only thing on his mind. Finally, after a while, he sighed and said, "Sorry, I just have some personal stuff I need to handle. It's nothing big. Don't worry about it." I tried to brush it off, but it felt off. His tone wasn't his usual relaxed self, and it made me wonder if something was really going on that he wasn't telling me. The rest of the evening was kind of awkward. We finished our meals and he suggested we go for a walk nearby. Well, I could tell he was distracted, barely saying anything as we walked around the block. By the time the night was over, I was ready to go home. It wasn't the worst date, but it definitely wasn't the best. I had a good time, but something felt weird. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just knew something wasn't right. When Trevor dropped me off, he gave me a quick hug and said he'd reach out soon. I didn't expect anything more, and I figured that was that. I didn't think much of it until I got home. I was just about to change into something more comfortable when I noticed I had a couple of new text messages. At first, I thought it was just a random notification from a friend, but then I saw the messages were from an unknown number. My heart sank as I read the first one. "You look just like her." The next one. "Is Trevor treating you well?" My stomach dropped. Who was this? How did they know anything about my date with Trevor? I didn't even know what to think, but I felt a weird sense of dread. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had somehow gotten my number and was just messing with me. But that didn't explain how they knew anything about the night, about Trevor and me. I tried to shake it off, but then more messages came. "Are you having fun with Trevor? Does he make you feel safe?" There was something unsettling about the way they were worded. It felt like whoever was texting me was watching. No one could have known that much unless they were there, unless they had been with us. I started to panic. What was going on? Who was sending these messages and why? My first thought was to text Trevor and ask if he knew anything, but then I hesitated. Maybe he'd think I was crazy, or maybe he'd think I was overreacting. I couldn't even bring myself to respond to the messages. Instead, I stared at my phone in complete disbelief. The next morning, I finally decided to text Trevor. I told him about the messages and asked if he knew anything about them. His reply came almost immediately. "What? That's weird. I don't know what's going on. Probably just some random person playing a prank. Sorry about that. I'll block the number if I can find it." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something didn't sit right with me. There was a strange, gut-churning feeling in my chest that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about how he had acted the night before, how distracted he was, and how he seemed so stressed out over something he wouldn't tell me. I started to wonder if he was hiding something or if he was involved somehow. The messages kept coming for the next few days. They got more personal. "Did you make it home okay? Does Trevor know you're safe? Does he tell you everything, or does he keep secrets?" It was like whoever was texting me knew more about Trevor than I did, more than I should have known. At that point, I wasn't sure if I should confront him again or just cut it off completely. But then the messages stopped. Completely. No more unknown numbers. No more strange, creepy texts. And I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it was just some weird coincidence. A week later, I saw Trevor had posted something on his social media. It was a picture of him and a woman I didn't recognize, laughing and holding hands. She looked so familiar, but I couldn't place her. I didn't know what to think. I thought back to the messages. You look just like her. I didn't reach out to him again. I didn't want to know the truth, not really. Part of me wondered if I'd ever see him again or if I'd ever get an explanation. But I just blocked him and moved on, hoping that would be the end of it. I still wonder about those texts, though. Who's behind them? And what did they want? I'll never know for sure, but sometimes, late at night, when I think back on that date, I can't ignore that something wasn't right, that maybe I wasn't the only one Trevor was seeing. Maybe there was more to that night than he ever told me. And I'm not sure I want to know what the truth is. I met Natalie through a mutual friend, and after chatting for a little while, we decided to go on a date. She suggested an Italian restaurant downtown that had great reviews, so we went with that. I was actually looking forward to it because the conversation online had been easy, and she seemed pretty down to earth. I'm not great at dating. Let's be real, I mostly just stick to the apps, but this felt like it could be one of those rare, nice first dates. At least, that's what I thought at first. We met outside the restaurant, and I could immediately tell she was cute, definitely what I'd expected from her pictures. We walked in together and things started out fine. The usual awkwardness of trying to make small talk, but that's expected, right? We sat down, ordered some wine, and started talking about basic stuff, or from hobbies, random things to get the conversation flowing. Nothing major, just light stuff, until she asked about my job. Now, this might sound weird, but I've always been a little cagey about talking about my work on dates. Maybe it's because I work in tech, and I get that reaction from people sometimes, like they think it's either super exciting or they have no idea what I'm talking about. But when Natalie asked, I figured, whatever, I'll just be casual about it. So I told her I worked in tech, which wasn't a big deal to me. I didn't think she'd be all that interested in the details. I was wrong. Out of nowhere, her whole vibe shifted. She leaned in a little, and her eyes lit up like I just told her I was a treasure hunter or something. What exactly do you do in tech? She asked, and I could tell she was really digging for more. I gave her a general answer, just saying I work on software development, and mentioned the company I was with. But then she hit me with more specific questions. What's your role? What's the company culture like? How big is your team? What do you get paid? Okay, now not one to be secret about my job, but all those details, that's personal. So I kept it vague, talking about my role but not giving away too much. I didn't want to make it weird, but the whole situation was starting to feel off. It's not like I was trying to hide anything, but I just didn't like how intensely she was asking about it. I'd been on enough dates to know that people don't usually get that invested in your job details that early on. The whole thing was starting to feel less like a date and more like an interrogation, but I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to stay cool. I casually changed the subject, thinking it would steer us away from work, but nope, she wasn't having any of it. She just kept going, asking who my boss was, what kinds of projects I worked on, and a bunch of other things I didn't think were appropriate to talk about with someone I just met. I felt the weirdness creeping in, but then came the kicker. As we were talking about my company, she casually mentioned, "Oh, I'm sure my cousin would love to work there. Maybe you could help him out?" My stomach literally dropped. That's when it clicked. It wasn't about me at all. She wasn't interested in me. She didn't care about me at all. She was just trying to use me to get to my job network. I couldn't believe it. At this point, I was done. I was trying to keep it polite, but everything she said after that felt calculated. It was like I wasn't a person anymore. I was just a stepping stone to whatever job opportunity her cousin was looking for. She kept asking questions about the company, how I could help her cousin, and what kind of connections I could make for him. All I could think was, is this really happening right now? I ended the date early, telling her I wasn't feeling great and that I needed to head home. Honestly, I was just trying to get out of there as quickly as possible. I wasn't rude or anything, just polite but firm. She didn't seem fazed. If anything, she seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't more enthusiastic about helping out her cousin. As we walked out of the restaurant, she mentioned that she hoped we could hang out again soon, and I just nodded along, barely listening. As soon as I got to my car, I felt this wave of unease wash over me. I couldn't believe how transparent she had been. It wasn't even subtle. It was like she had a plan the entire time, and it was just a means to an end. When I got home that night, I did a quick scroll through LinkedIn before heading to bed, and that's when I saw it. A new connection request from someone with the same last name as Natalie. Her cousin, I assumed. It was the same night, too, less than a few hours after the date ended. I didn't even have to look at his profile to know what was going on. This was exactly what she had been after the whole time. Her cousin was probably trying to get into the tech industry or something, and she thought I'd just hand over some contacts. It made me sick to think about it. I blocked him immediately, then I went ahead and blocked Natalie too. It felt good to take control of the situation, but it was still unsettling. How transparent can people be? And how often does something like this happen? It made me feel like I was some kind of mark for her to exploit, and honestly, I just felt used. To this day, I still can't shake the weird feeling. I know I made the right call by ending the date early, but the whole thing just stuck with me. It was a bizarre experience. I've heard people say stuff like you never really know someone or don't mix business with pleasure, but this was next level manipulation. It wasn't even a little sneaky. She just laid it all out there like she thought I wouldn't notice. I'm just glad I dodged that bullet. There's no telling what could have happened if I hadn't realized what she was really after. But one thing's for sure, it made me way more cautious about who I let into my personal life from now on. Some people are just out there looking to use you for their own gain, and you have to be careful not to let them in. Here's the deal. I met Lenny on a dating app, and we hit it off pretty quickly. We had great conversations, and he seemed pretty chill. So when he suggested grabbing drinks at a cozy bar downtown, I figured why not. I mean, the guy seemed genuine enough, and it was a Thursday evening, so I wasn't expecting anything too wild. The bar was small, dimly lit, the kind of place you could easily lose track of time in. It had that warm, inviting vibe with a jazz band playing softly in the corner. Honestly, it was the perfect setting for a casual first date. The conversation flowed effortlessly at first. We talked about the usual stuff: hobbies, favorite music, what brought us to the app in the first place. I could tell right away he was the type of guy who liked to joke around, and he made me laugh a few times. Everything felt fine, right up until he dropped this bomb. Out of nowhere, he casually mentioned that he still lived with his ex-wife. I blinked, trying to process that for a second. Okay, weird, but I wasn't going to judge right away. Maybe it was one of those it's complicated situations. He explained that it was for financial reasons and that they were on good terms, just sharing a place until they could figure things out. I wasn't about to dig into the details because, honestly, everyone's got their own stuff, and who am I to question it? But something about it didn't sit right with me. It was just off. I didn't let it linger too long in my mind, though, because he seemed like he wanted to move on to something lighter. So he pulled out his phone, and I figured he was going to show me something random or maybe a cute pic of his dog or something. Instead, he pulled up a picture of a little kid, grinning in front of a birthday cake. Cute, right? Totally normal picture. He smiled proudly and started talking about how much he loved being a dad, how much he cherished his time with his kid, the whole spiel. But here's where things got really strange. As he held up the phone, I glanced at the screen, and wait a second, I recognized that picture. I'd seen it before, but not on his phone and not of his kid. It was a photo I'd seen on the dating app just a few days ago, in fact. He'd used it as his profile picture, but it wasn't even a photo of him. It was a picture of his kid, and it didn't even look like the kind of picture a parent would post online. It looked like it had been pulled off some social media profile or a family photo album, like he was just showing it off to seem more relatable or whatever. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't the first time he used it. I didn't let on that I'd noticed anything. I tried to act like I hadn't seen it before. But in that moment, I realized something wasn't right. It wasn't just a weird living situation or the fact that he was still talking about his ex-wife. It was the fact that he was using this photo of his kid to impress women. And for what? To get sympathy. To seem like he was more family-oriented than he actually was. I wasn't sure what was going through his head, but it was starting to freak me out. I kept listening to him talk about his kid and how much he loved being a dad, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake this growing sense of unease. I thought about how many other women he might have shown this same picture to, how many other first dates he had been on, using this kid's face as a way to tug at their heartstrings. Was this some kind of game he was playing? Was he just going through the motions of trying to appear like a great guy, but in reality, he was just trying to manipulate people into thinking he was someone he wasn't? I couldn't shake that thought. I found myself feeling lost in my own head, watching him talk about his kid but not really hearing anything he was saying. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. I felt like I was on the outside of some weird little performance, like I was just another mark in a long line of women he tried to impress with his fake dad persona. I didn't want to be rude, so I kept up the conversation, even though every word out of his mouth felt more and more like a lie. I just wasn't into it anymore. The date had gone from feeling comfortable to completely uncomfortable in a matter of minutes. I could feel the awkwardness settling in, and I knew I had to get out of there. So I excused myself to the bathroom. I didn't even really need to go, I just needed a second to collect myself. When I came back, he was still sitting there, talking away, completely oblivious to the fact that I was now 100% freaked out by him. I sat down, tried to muster up some enthusiasm, but I just couldn't. I could still see the photo of his kid in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about how many other women had probably seen it and bought into whatever he was selling. I fumbled with my drink for a while, feeling the minutes drag on. Finally, I decided to cut my losses and end the date. I just wasn't feeling it anymore. I wasn't even mad at him. I was just creeped out, so I told him I had to go. I wasn't rude, but I was firm. I didn't want to waste my time or his, and I certainly didn't want to keep sitting there while he went on and on about his perfect dad life. When I left the bar, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept wondering how many other women he had used that same photo with. How many times had he played the same act, trying to get sympathy or attention? It wasn't just the photo that bothered me. It was the whole vibe he gave off. Like he was a completely different person, putting on this facade to get whatever he wanted out of people. A few days later, I went back on the app to check out my messages, and guess what I saw? Lenny had already updated his profile, and there it was again, the same picture of his kid. But now I wasn't just freaked out by the photo. I was freaked out by how transparent it all seemed. How easily he had manipulated me into thinking he was a nice guy, just another guy trying to get over his divorce and move on. I haven't heard from him since. I blocked him just to make sure there was no chance of him trying to reach out again. But every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder how many other women are out there, looking at that same picture, falling for the same act. It was messed up, and the fact that it felt so calculating just made it all the worse. I was looking forward to meeting Marissa. Our conversations online had been easy and fun. She seemed like someone I could get along with, witty, sharp, and just a little sarcastic. The kind of person who could make me laugh even on a bad day. After chatting for a few weeks, we decided to meet up at a small, quiet cafe in the middle of town. It was a perfect spot, low-key, cozy, and a little off the beaten path. I thought we could talk without being interrupted and get to know each other better. But when I walked in and saw her, I knew immediately something was off. She wasn't what I expected. In fact, she didn't even look remotely like the picture on her profile. It wasn't that she was unattractive, but the smile was gone, and there was a look in her eyes that made me pause for a second. It wasn't anger, but something colder, something that made me feel like I wasn't walking into a date, but into a situation I hadn't signed up for. She greeted me with a smile, and we sat down, but the awkwardness between us was palpable. She immediately dove into a topic that, honestly, I wasn't expecting. Before we even ordered, she started talking about how much she hated modern relationships, how everything was so superficial, and how people weren't real with each other anymore. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, trying to keep the conversation going. But she didn't seem interested in talking about anything light or fun. No, instead, she jumped straight into complaining about her ex. She went on and on about him, not just for a few minutes, but for a solid 45 minutes. I couldn't believe how much she had to say. It wasn't just a rant. It was like she was trying to convince herself that he was a problem, not her. She said he was a good guy, but too sensitive, which in itself was a red flag. I'm all for honesty, but she just kept repeating how he didn't meet her needs, how he was too emotional and couldn't keep up with her intensity. It was exhausting, but I stayed quiet, figuring she'd get it out of her system. I didn't want to interrupt, and I certainly didn't want to seem rude by cutting her off. I was trying to be patient, but the more she talked, the more I felt like I was in a therapy session, first date. The worst part, she casually slipped in that she was still seeing him on the side while she was dating again, like it was no big deal. She said she hadn't told him she was seeing anyone else because, and I quote, "It's not his business if I'm still living my life." I couldn't process what she was saying at first. I mean, how was that even a thing? I had just met her, and already she was telling me about this messed up dynamic she had with her ex. I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat there, feeling my stomach tighten. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be understanding or just nod along. It felt like I was sitting in front of someone who didn't have a clue about what a healthy relationship even looked like. Her behavior seemed so disconnected from any sense of self-awareness or respect for boundaries that I started wondering if maybe I was the one who was out of touch. Was I missing something? Was this normal for her, or was she just throwing it all out there to see what I'd do? The whole time, I kept trying to come up with a way to steer the conversation somewhere else. But every time I tried to change the subject, she just looped back to her ex. It was like she was caught in this cycle, stuck in the past, with no interest in moving forward. I could feel the vibe in the cafe shift around us, and I could tell the waitress was starting to get uncomfortable. I started getting that feeling in the pit of my stomach, the one that says, "You're not supposed to be here." It's like you've walked into someone else's messy personal drama, and now you're stuck in it. I glanced at my watch, thinking I should have left about 30 minutes ago, but I didn't want to be rude, so I stayed. But then she hit me with something that I really couldn't ignore. She leaned in a little, lowered her voice, and said, "I guess I'm just not sure if I'm ready to give up the fun part of my life, you know. My ex was a good guy, but he's a total bore. I mean, you can't just settle down when you're not even sure what you want yet, right? I can't just be with someone who wants to do the same old thing every day." That's when it hit me. She wasn't interested in me at all. She wasn't looking for a real connection. She was looking for validation. She wanted to talk about her ex because he was still in her life, and she hadn't fully let go of that. She wanted to hear that I was okay with all of it, that it was all fine, and that I was okay with being a rebound or some temporary distraction. The worst part, I could see the appeal to her. She wasn't looking for someone to love. She was looking for someone to feed her ego. Someone to tell her that it was okay to keep playing games with her ex while dating other people. The air around us felt suffocating at this point, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I stood up to use the bathroom, and when I came back, she was still talking like nothing had changed. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the endless complaining or the fact that she seemed completely disconnected from reality, but at that moment I knew I had to get out of there. I don't think I said anything. I just grabbed my coat, slipped some money on the table, and left. I didn't look back. The whole thing just felt wrong. She was clearly in some weird mental loop, stuck on her ex, while she tried to convince herself that she was fine. It was like she didn't even know how to have a real, healthy conversation. How could I expect her to understand what a real relationship was when she was still holding on to someone she didn't even respect? It wasn't even about the date anymore. I felt more like a therapist or a sounding board than anything else, and I had no intention of sticking around for her to unload all her emotional baggage on me. When I left, I felt kind of relieved, but also disturbed, not just by her behavior, but by how easily she had shown me a side of her life that was so disconnected from anything that seemed healthy. I guess some people are just so caught up in their own drama that they forget what it means to actually connect with someone. Anyway, I'm sure she's out there dating again, telling her next date all about her ex just like she did with me. But I don't think I'm ever going to find out. After that night, I knew I didn't want to be a part of whatever mess she was creating. I thought it was going to be a great night. I had been chatting with Bianca for a few weeks, and we had a solid connection online. She was funny, smart, and seemed to be into the same things I liked. We decided to meet up for dinner at a cozy little bistro downtown. The place was perfect. Quiet, relaxed, just the kind of vibe that made me feel like this could actually be a good first date. But the second we sat down, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but I could tell Bianca wasn't really present. She pulled out her phone right away, like it was the most normal thing to do during a first date. At first, I thought maybe she was checking work emails or something, but after a few minutes, it was clear she was texting. And not just any texting. She was responding to texts like there was some kind of ongoing conversation she couldn't ignore. I kept trying to make conversation, but it was like pulling teeth. I'd ask her something and she'd answer, but then go straight back to her phone. There was one point when she actually chuckled to herself, like something was funny in the messages she was reading. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to seem pushy, but it felt like I was barely even there. After about 20 minutes of this, I finally couldn't take it anymore and asked who she was texting. She told me it was just a friend, but I could see the shift in her face I wasn't supposed to ask. She immediately became defensive, telling me it was complicated, and that she didn't need to explain herself. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel myself getting frustrated. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I wasn't enjoying myself. I didn't come here to be ignored. I didn't come here to compete with her phone, and I definitely didn't come here to feel like I was bothering her by asking simple questions. The rest of the dinner went downhill fast. She kept checking her phone, typing away, not even bothering to look at me while I was talking. I'd catch her smirking or typing quickly, like she was part of some inside joke with whoever she was talking to. The more it went on, the more uncomfortable I became. It wasn't just the phone, it was the way she acted. The way she completely shut down when I asked her about it. She wasn't even trying to pretend to be interested in me anymore. It was like I was just there to fill the seat at the table, not actually a person she was supposed to be connecting with. I started to think maybe it's just me. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But I didn't want to waste my time, so after a few more awkward silences, I decided to end the date. I told her I had to leave, and she barely reacted. She didn't even try to convince me to stay or apologize for being rude. She just looked at her phone and mumbled something about needing to go home anyway. I left the restaurant feeling a little pissed, but mostly just confused. What was the point of all that? If she wasn't interested, why even show up? I didn't get it. But as the days passed, I started to piece things together. It wasn't until I bumped into a mutual friend that I learned what was really going on. Turns out, Bianca had been dating multiple guys at the same time. She had a whole network of men she was juggling, including me. She wasn't looking for anything serious with anyone. I wasn't just a backup. She had no intention of really getting to know me. I was just another option on her list, someone she could hang out with if her other plans didn't work out. She wasn't even pretending to care about me with a date, and the way she acted made so much more sense in hindsight. I found out from this mutual friend that Bianca had a reputation for this kind of thing. She was always too busy to commit to anyone, always got caught up in drama with whoever she was seeing, and constantly made excuses for why things never worked out. The texting during the date. She was probably talking to another guy, who knows. It wasn't about me at all. It was about keeping her options open. She wasn't looking for someone to connect with. She just wanted to keep all her doors open and play the game. The worst part, I felt kind of dumb for not seeing it sooner. I should notice the red flags, the constant phone checking, the defensiveness when I asked a simple question, the way she didn't really seem to care about our time together. But I didn't, and now it was just another guy in her rotation, probably just another one of her friends she was keeping around for when it suited her. I blocked her on everything, of course. I didn't want to deal with someone like that. It wasn't even about being mad. It was more about feeling completely disrespected. She didn't care about me. She wasn't even trying to get to know me. I was just another option she had in her back pocket. It felt weird, almost like I had been part of some weird experiment or game, and that thought bothered me more than I can explain. It wasn't the worst day I've ever had, but it sure felt like the most manipulative one. She didn't have the decency to at least act like she cared about what I was saying or respect my time. And that's probably the most disturbing part, how someone could be so indifferent to another person's feelings, all while pretending everything was fine. I was just another backup plan for her, and the more I thought about it, the more pissed off I got. I'm sure she's out there doing the same thing to someone else now, texting, juggling, keeping all her options open, and never actually taking the time to care about anyone. I guess that's just the way she plays the game. But I'm done with it. The whole thing was just a huge wake-up call that I wasn't the only one on the other side of the screen, and that's something I won't forget anytime soon. I never thought a first date could go this sideways, but here I am trying to process what exactly happened. I met Anthony on a dating app, and after a few weeks of chatting, we decided to meet up for dinner at this nice Italian restaurant downtown. The place had a cozy vibe, dim lighting, and soft jazz playing in the background. Pretty much everything you could ask for when you're hoping for a chill first date. I was nervous, of course, but I thought it would be fine. I mean, we talked a lot online, and he seemed like a cool guy. At least that's how I thought he came across. The beginning of the evening wasn't bad at all. We talked about the usual stuff, where we grew up, what we like to do in our free time, that kind of thing. But slowly, it started to get a little weird. We were in the middle of talking about work, and he said something that caught me off guard. We were discussing how busy we were with our careers, and then he made this comment about my job. He said that I probably could do better if I wasn't so busy all the time. At first, I thought he meant I could make more money or something, but no. It was like he was subtly saying I was wasting my potential by working the way I do. It wasn't a huge deal, but it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe he just didn't know what he was talking about. But then he doubled down and said something even stranger. He started going on about how I shouldn't settle for a career that limits my potential. It didn't even make sense. I mean, yeah, work can be frustrating sometimes, but I never thought I was limiting myself. I enjoy my job. I like what I do. So, why was he saying this? Was he trying to push me into some career change I didn't ask for? At this point, I started to feel like he was projecting some kind of insecurity or superiority complex onto me. Then the conversation took an even weirder turn. Out of nowhere, he asked me if I had ever cheated in a relationship. I was completely caught off guard. I don't know about you, but that's not a question you ask someone on a first date. I didn't know what to say, and I felt a little sick to my stomach. He just casually dropped it like it was no big deal. And when I told him no, that I never had, he looked at me with this weird look, like he didn't believe me or something. That's when it took an even stranger twist. He didn't drop it. Instead, he leaned in a little like he was about to tell me some big life secret and said, "Well, you should try it sometime. It'll teach you more about yourself." I was stunned. I couldn't even process what I had just heard. Who says something like that? What kind of person casually tells someone they should cheat? The worst part was how entitled he sounded, like it was some kind of life lesson that he thought I needed to learn. I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat there, not even sure if he was joking or being serious. The whole vibe shifted after that. I couldn't even look at him the same way anymore. I felt like everything he had said was wrapped in this weird air of superiority and control, like he was trying to tell me what I should do with my life. It was uncomfortable, and I could feel my stomach turning with every word he said after that. He didn't even seem to notice how awkward it had gotten. It was like he was on top of it, oblivious to how completely out of line he was. I tried to salvage the day after that, but the mood had already soured. Every time he opened his mouth, I just wanted to get out of there. I was struggling to keep the conversation going, but he kept making weird, uncomfortable comments that just made the whole situation worse. At one point, he even mentioned how he loved the idea of open relationships, and I didn't know if I should laugh or run out of there. I mean, I'm all for people doing what works for them, but this was way too much, especially on a first date. Finally, I couldn't take any more. I was done. I had to leave. I didn't even finish my meal. I just made up some excuse about needing to get up early the next day and I bolted. He didn't seem too fazed by it, which was honestly even more unsettling. It was like he didn't care that he completely ruined the evening. I'm sure he probably thought it was just a small weird hiccup that wasn't a big deal, but it was to me. I wasn't going to sit through a night where I felt uncomfortable and disrespected just to be polite. The next couple of days were spent processing everything he said, and honestly, the more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. It wasn't just the weird comments about my career or the awkward cheating conversation. It was the sense of entitlement he had about my life. He really thought he could tell me what I should do, what I should try, like he was some sort of expert in how I should live my life. It was creepy. I felt like I had been treated like some kind of project to fix rather than a person to get to know. And the thing that kept bugging me was how calm and collected he seemed throughout the whole evening. Like, it didn't even register for him that maybe, just maybe, he was being completely inappropriate. He didn't seem to care that he made me feel uncomfortable. All he cared about was pushing his opinions onto me. It wasn't just a bad date. It was a giant red flag, and I couldn't believe I didn't see it sooner. I blocked him after that. I didn't want any part of that energy in my life. Honestly, I just wanted to forget about it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that people like him exist. They walk around acting like they know what's best for everyone else, pushing boundaries and making others feel small just to feel bigger. It's a weird thing to think about, but I guess some people really do think they can control others, and I'm not going to let anyone make me feel like that again. And that was my first date with Anthony. And to this day, I still don't get how someone could be so entitled to tell me what to do with my life. It's just one of those experiences that sticks with you, where you realize that some people really think they can manipulate you into thinking they know better. But no, not me. I'm never letting that kind of person get close to me again. I met Joshua through some mutual friends at a party, and to be honest, I didn't think much of him at first. He seemed nice enough, a little quiet but friendly. We ended up talking for a bit, and after a while, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I thought, sure, why not? He seemed like a decent guy, and it'd be good to get to know him better outside of the party scene. We picked a coffee shop downtown, one of those cozy, artsy places where the baristas looked like they'd just stepped out of a hipster magazine. It was a calm morning, and the vibe of the cafe was perfect. We grabbed our drinks, sat down by the window, and started chatting. Everything seemed fine at first. We talked about our jobs, what we'd like to do for fun, the usual stuff. But then, about halfway through the conversation, Joshua said something that made me pause. He started talking about his friends and how they always told him he was too picky when it came to dating. At first, I thought he was joking. Like, maybe he was being self-deprecating or just messing around. But no, it got real fast. He started explaining that he had a list of deal breakers for potential partners. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone has preferences, right? I figured it might be something like, I don't like it when people are rude, or I prefer someone who enjoys hiking, typical stuff. But then he started to read it aloud. No tattoos, he said, looking me dead in the eye as if waiting for me to react. No long hair. He continued to list off things that I was pretty sure weren't even real deal breakers, just preferences. Like, no one had ever said they wouldn't date me because I had long hair. It felt like he was making a point to list out the most random stuff he could think of. Then he dropped the bomb. He looked down at his coffee, took a sip, and casually said, "And I wouldn't date anyone who isn't from a family with money." I thought I heard him wrong. My heart kind of skipped a beat and I laughed, assuming he was joking. But his face didn't change. He was dead serious. There was no hint of humor in his tone, no smile. I felt like the air in the cafe got a little thicker. The clinking of cups and chatter from other tables seemed to fade as I tried to process what he just said. He wasn't joking. He wasn't making a quirky comment. He genuinely felt that way. I tried to laugh it off at first, hoping he would realize how ridiculous it sounded. I made some comment about how that sounded a bit shallow. I mean, it wasn't like I had tons of money either, but that wasn't something I would ever hold against someone. It just didn't sit right with me. But he didn't seem fazed. He just shrugged it off like it was no big deal. "I don't have time to waste on people who don't meet my standards," he said, almost matter-of-factly. Like there was no room for discussion. That was his rule, and that was that. The whole conversation left me feeling weird. Like, this wasn't just about preferences anymore. This was him trying to make it clear that if you didn't fit into his very narrow version of what was acceptable, you weren't worth his time. I mean, I get that everyone has their own standards for a relationship, but when you start listing things that have nothing to do with who someone actually is, and then justifying it by saying you don't want to waste time, that's when it crosses a line. It wasn't just superficial, it was controlling. I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there, feeling more and more uncomfortable with every word he said. He kept talking about how he had worked hard to get to where he was, how he wasn't about to settle for someone who couldn't match his level of success. But as he kept going, it started to feel less like he was telling me about his preferences, and more like he was sizing me up, judging me based on superficial traits that had nothing to do with who I was as a person. I kept thinking to myself, what's wrong with just enjoying life and meeting people without this ridiculous checklist? I didn't care what his family made, or whether someone had tattoos. I cared about who they were, how they treated people, and if they were kind and genuine. But that wasn't the vibe I was getting from him. It felt like he was trying to place everyone into these little boxes, and if you didn't fit in, you weren't worth his time. It was honestly kind of shocking. He went on, and I kind of just tuned him out. I couldn't bring myself to keep listening to him as he went off about all the ways people fail to meet his standards. I couldn't believe I was sitting there actually listening to this guy. I knew I had to get out of there. My stomach was turning, and I couldn't even look at him without feeling disgusted. I didn't want to waste another second. I made some excuse about needing to get home, and he didn't seem to mind at all. It was like he didn't even notice how uncomfortable I was. When I left, I was flooded with so many different thoughts. I was angry, confused, and honestly just kind of sad. People like Joshua existed, and that realization hit me hard. It wasn't even just his comments about money or tattoos. It was the way he treated people like they were nothing more than checkboxes on a list. It made me wonder how many other people he tried to box into his perfect little world. How many people had he dismissed without ever really getting to know them? Later that week, I found out from a mutual friend that Joshua had been dating several other women at the same time, all while expecting them to meet the same ridiculous criteria. Apparently, he had a habit of treating dating like it was a competition, constantly sizing up potential partners, as if they were contestants on a game show. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how toxic that kind of mentality was. I blocked him on everything after that. I didn't want someone like that anywhere near my life. The whole thing was just such a weird experience, and I'm still not sure what kind of person would treat dating like it's a job interview. Honestly, it wasn't just the weird list that bothered me. It was the way he thought it was okay to judge people based on things that didn't even matter. To me, that's not love or respect. It's just control. And I wasn't about to stick around for that. That coffee date with Joshua, definitely the last one I'll ever have with him. I met Claire on a dating app, and after a few days of chatting, we decided to meet up for a drink. She seemed cool enough over text, funny, outgoing, and easy to talk to. I figured it was going to be one of those casual, no pressure dates. I heard horror stories from friends about awkward dates and people who just didn't click, but I figured Claire seemed like a solid person, so I didn't expect anything to go wrong. We met at this cozy, dimly lit bar downtown. It was the kind of place with dark wood paneling, fairy lights twinkling above, and that soft background music that just makes everything feel a little more relaxed. The perfect setting for a first date, right? We ordered drinks and started chatting. Things were going pretty smoothly at first. We talked about our jobs, hobbies, the usual small talk. Honestly, I wasn't expecting fireworks, but it wasn't awkward either. Everything was fine, until it wasn't. At some point, the conversation shifted to relationships, and that's when things started to get weird. Claire started talking about her ex. Now, don't get me wrong. Everyone's been through breakups, and it's normal to mention exes from time to time, but this was different. She started saying how she had been through a lot with him and how their breakup was particularly tough on her. I didn't think much of it at first. People go through rough patches, right? We've all been there, but then she kept talking about him, and it started to get strange. She mentioned that she still had a key to his apartment. That caught me off guard. I mean, I get that breakups are messy, and sometimes people don't immediately give back keys or belongings, but she said it so casually, like it was no big deal. At first, I thought maybe she was just talking about it as a past thing, like a leftover reminder of a relationship that had been over for a while, but no, it was still an active part of her life. She said she still had the key because, well, he never asked for it back. Okay, sure, maybe I could understand if they were on good terms or something. But then she dropped another bombshell. They still texted every single day. That's when things started to feel really off. She didn't just mention it in passing either. She made it clear how much she still talked to him, how often they texted, and how it was completely normal. She went on and on about how she was there for him, how he was going through a tough time, and how they had just had this bond. It was like she was still emotionally attached to him in a way that didn't seem healthy at all. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but she wasn't having it. She was so wrapped up in talking about him that she didn't seem to notice how uncomfortable I was starting to feel. Then she casually mentioned that sometimes she would pop by his place just to check on him. I didn't know what to say at that point. I just stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. She was talking about how she would go to his new apartment, even though he had moved on and was in a new relationship. And get this, she was totally unapologetic about it. No embarrassment, no hesitation. She just said it like it was the most normal thing in the world. I tried to ask her if she thought that was a little strange, and she got defensive almost immediately. She acted like I was the one being unreasonable for questioning it. It's just how things are, she said. You wouldn't understand. Her tone made it clear that she didn't think there was anything wrong with what she was doing. She was so caught up in her own reasoning, so convinced that she was right, that she didn't even notice how weird this all sounded. At that moment, I just couldn't handle it anymore. I was trying to stay polite, trying to keep the conversation light, but I could feel this pit growing in my stomach. I wasn't sure if she was still in love with her ex or if she was just obsessed with him, but whatever it wasn't healthy. It wasn't even remotely normal to still have a key or ex a place and check on them while they were in a new relationship. And the fact that she didn't seem to understand that made me feel like I was talking to someone who was living in a completely different reality. I decided to cut the date short. I made an excuse about having to get up early the next day, and I quickly paid my tab and left. The whole time I was walking in my car, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. It felt like I had just witnessed a side of her that was unsettling, a side that was way too obsessed with someone who wasn't in her life anymore. That night, I kept running the conversation over and over in my head. I tried to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how messed up everything she said was. Claire clearly wasn't over her ex. In fact, it seemed like she was still deeply attached to him despite everything. And that attachment wasn't just lingering in the background, it was part of her everyday life. She was still texting him constantly, still going to his apartment, still emotionally invested in someone who had moved on. The whole thing was beyond strange. It was unhealthy. I kept thinking about how she seemed to have no boundaries when it came to him. And the scariest part, she didn't even see anything wrong with it. She just thought it was normal, like that was the way things were supposed to be after a breakup. After that date, I knew I couldn't see her again. I didn't want to be a part of any of that drama. I didn't want to get tangled up in a situation where someone was still holding on to the past in such a toxic way. So I ended up ghosting her. I didn't reach out, and I didn't respond to her messages. Honestly, I couldn't bring myself to explain it. What would I even say? Hey, I don't think we're a match because you're still obsessed with your ex. That sounded insane. As time went on, I learned that Claire had a habit of clinging to exes. One of my friends had dated her briefly before me, and she'd been the same way with him. It was like she couldn't move on from a relationship, no matter how unhealthy it was. I felt bad for the guy, but at the same time, I was glad I got out of that situation before things got worse. In the end, Claire wasn't just a girl with a messy breakup. She was someone who couldn't let go of the past, and I was about to be dragged into that mess. And that's the last time I ever saw her. I don't know what it is about first dates, but there's always this strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. You meet someone new, you're trying to figure out if there's any spark, and you're hoping they're not some kind of weirdo. That's exactly how I was feeling when I met Garrett. I had met him on a dating app, and we decided to grab drinks at this laid-back bar downtown. It was the kind of place where the lights were dim, the music was just the right volume, and the bartenders knew how to make a solid cocktail. Perfect spot for a first date, right? We sat at a little booth, chatted for a bit about our lives, our jobs, our hobbies. Honestly, things were going great. I liked his humor, and he seemed pretty easygoing, a little sarcastic, but in a fun way. I figured we were hitting it off. I mean, the date was going better than expected. But that's when things started to take a strange turn. At first, it was just small talk about relationships, past ones, the usual stuff you get to when you're feeling out a person. But then Garrett dropped a bombshell. He started talking about how he had a thing for people who were already in relationships. I kind of paused for a second. Was he joking? Surely he was joking, right? People don't actually say things like that seriously. But as he went on, it became clear that he wasn't kidding. He explained that he had been seeing a married woman for months. It wasn't just some casual affair either. He said that he didn't feel guilty about it at all, which honestly was what made my stomach turn. The worst part, his reasoning was that the woman's marriage wasn't happy anyway. In his mind, it made what he was doing totally okay. I was sitting there trying to process what I was hearing. He seemed completely unfazed by what he was admitting, as if this was just some normal part of his life. I don't know about you, but that's not the kind of thing I expect to hear on a first date. I mean, how could he think that cheating was okay just because someone's marriage was unhappy? It was like he was trying to justify his actions by putting all the blame on someone else's relationship. At first, I just tried to laugh it off. Maybe I thought he was just talking out of his ass. Maybe he was testing the waters to see how I would react. But then, as he went on, it became clear that this was more than just a bad joke. He was actually serious about this. He seemed almost proud of the fact that he had been involved with a married woman, and it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite explain. I started thinking about how many other women might have been in his sights, how many people he could have been messing with, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to explain to him that I wasn't interested in that kind of situation, that I didn't want to get involved with someone who thought that being with people who were already committed was okay. But instead of backing off or realizing how messed up it was, he got defensive. He started saying things like, well, I thought you'd be more open-minded about it, as though I was the one being unreasonable. At that point, I just couldn't keep going. I knew I had to leave. I was already starting to feel that sinking feeling in my stomach that you get when you realize you're talking to someone who was just off. I didn't need to hear any more. I didn't want to hear any more. I made up some excuse about having a busy day ahead of me and said I had to go. As I stood up to leave, I couldn't help but wonder if he had done this before. I mean, what kind of person is so casual about cheating and deception? Who thinks it's acceptable to knowingly get involved with someone who's already taken? I left the bar as quickly as I could, trying not to let it ruin my night, but I couldn't shake the thought of it. How could anyone think it was okay to be involved in that kind of situation? And worse, how could they act so nonchalant about it? I don't know what Garrett was hoping for on that date. Maybe he thought it'd be into his bad boy image, or maybe he thought he could talk me into something I wasn't interested in. Either way, I felt disgusted by the whole thing. It wasn't just that he was cheating, it was the fact that he had no problem talking about it like it was just another normal part of his life. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how messed up it all was. People like Garrett weren't just trying to bend the rules, they were straight up breaking them, and they didn't even seem to care. What bothered me even more was that Garrett seemed to think that I'd be okay with it, that I'd be fine with his messed up sense of morals. The whole thing felt like a red flag, like a warning that I should have seen from the beginning. But when you're out on a date, you don't always expect to hear something that throws you off so much. You think you're going to hear about someone's favorite movie, their dog, what they like to do on weekends, not their personal code of ethics when it comes to cheating. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to tell myself it was just one bad date, but honestly, it was more than that. It was a reminder that there are people out there who think nothing of crossing lines and hurting others for their own satisfaction. And it made me wonder how many other people like Garrett were out there manipulating situations for their own gain with no regard for anyone else's feelings. Needless to say, I never spoke to Garrett again. I blocked his number and deleted his profile from the dating app. I didn't want any part of whatever he had going on. It wasn't just a bad date. It was a glimpse into the kind of person he was, and I wasn't interested in seeing any more. I don't know if he ever figured out why I left so suddenly, but I really didn't care. Some things are just better left in the past.